I kind of realized how powerful Tupac and I was.
28 years, the murder of Biggie Smalls haunted hip-hop. No arrests, no justice, just silence. In the shadows of Los Angeles, the story became legend, whispered in studios, dissected in documentaries, and passed down through lyrics like a ghost that wouldn't rest. The details were burned into history. 4 bullets, a black Chevy Impala, and a man whose talent had just begun to peak. But now in 2025, a former LAPD detective has broken that silence. He's named the man who pulled the trigger, the one who ordered it, and the chilling reason why. His account doesn't just answer questions, it confirms long-rumored suspicions and pulls the curtain back on a web of loyalty, power, and revenge. What you're about to hear is the case, solved at last, and why the truth is far darker than anyone imagined. And it's bad. It was Saturday night, March 8, 1997, and Los Angeles was buzzing. The Soul Train Music Awards had just wrapped, bringing together the biggest names in R&B, rap, and entertainment. Among them was Christopher Wallace, known to millions as the Notorious B.I.G. For months, he had avoided major public appearances on the West Coast after the death of Tupac Shakur just 6 months earlier. But this night was different. Biggie was in the city not to stoke the feud, but to promote peace and his new double album, Life After Death. After the awards, Biggie and his crew headed to a Vibe magazine after-party at the Peterson Automotive Museum. He arrived with producer Sean Puffy Combs and their entourage. Security was tight. Inside, cameras flashed, laughter echoed, and Biggie moved through the crowd with surprising ease for a man who knew danger was never far away. But at 12:45 a.m., the mood shifted. Biggie's team decided to leave early. Outside, the streets were unusually busy for that time of night. Celebrities, fans, and curious onlookers spilling into the cool air. The convoy formed quickly. Puffy's SUV in the lead, Biggie's dark green GMC Suburban behind, followed by security vehicles. The route was familiar, heading toward a hotel. But fate waited at the intersection of Fairfax Avenue and Wilshire Boulevard. The light turned red, forcing the convoy to stop. Then, a black Chevy Impala eased up beside Biggie's SUV on the driver's side. The movement wasn't rushed, it was calculated. Witnesses later said the shooter raised the 9mm pistol and fired 4 times through the window. The bullets tore through the night, striking Biggie in the chest. The SUV lunged forward as the driver raced towards Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. Security followed close, the lights flashing in panic. But at 1:15 a.m., doctors pronounced Christopher Wallace dead. It happened in front of dozens of people, yet the killer disappeared into the Los Angeles darkness, leaving only questions, grief, and the first sparks of a storm that would burn for decades. But the night's tragedy didn't begin at that red light, and it didn't end in the hospital. It was Saturday night, March 8, 1997, and Los Angeles felt alive. The Soul Train Music Awards had just ended, spilling stars, producers, and industry power players into the city's night air. Limousines rolled down Wilshire, flashes from paparazzi cameras lit up the sidewalks, and the energy of Hollywood seemed to hum in every corner. Christopher Wallace, the Notorious B.I.G., had been in town for a few days. It was his first major public appearance in Los Angeles since Tupac's murder in Las Vegas 6 months earlier. The East Coast-West Coast tension still lingered like smoke in the air, but Biggie carried himself with the calm of a man who believed the worst was behind him. He spoke of promoting peace, pushing his upcoming double album, Life After Death, and leaving the feud behind. That night, after the awards, Big and Puffy Combs joined their circle at the Vibe magazine afterparty hosted at the Peterson Automotive Museum. The building's glass facade glimmered under spotlights as luxury cars pulled into the valet. Inside, champagne flowed, music thumped, and Biggie was seen laughing with friends, shaking hands with fans, and posing for photos.
But by 12:45 a.m., they decided to leave early. Puffy's SUV pulled out first. Biggie's green GMC Suburban second, with security trailing in other vehicles. Witnesses outside the museum noticed the relaxed atmosphere. They didn't seem in a rush, one recalled years later. It just looked like they were heading out. No tension, no rush. The streets weren't empty. A mix of late-night traffic, event attendees, and curious onlookers still milled around. As the convoy rolled toward Fairfax Avenue, streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. At the red light on Wilshire, the SUVs came to a stop. Then came the moment that would echo for decades. From the shadows, a black Chevy Impala slid alongside Biggie's vehicle on the driver's side. It didn't speed up, it crept into position. In the seconds before the shots, a few bystanders saw movement in the driver window but couldn't process what they were looking at. 4 gunshots cracked through the still night air. Witnesses heard glass shatter. Inside the SUV, Biggie slumped forward, hit in the chest. Screams broke the brief silence. Puffy's driver hit the gas. Biggie's SUV followed, tires squealing as they raced towards Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. The black Impala turned and disappeared into the grid of Los Angeles streets. No one chased it. By 1:15 a.m., Christopher Wallace was pronounced dead. The hospital's fluorescent lights were harsh and unfeeling, a cold contrast to the energy he had carried just an hour before. And while those final minutes were seared into the minds of everyone there, the truth about why it happened and who ordered it would remain buried for nearly 3 decades. Before the bullets in the headlines, there was friendship. In the early 1990s, Tupac Shakur and Christopher Wallace were not rivals, they were allies. Tupac let Biggie crash on his couch, showed him around Los Angeles, and even gave him advice on performance and the business side of music. The two spoke the same language: hunger, ambition, and the dream of turning street stories into platinum records. But in hip-hop, alliances can fracture fast. By late 1994, the balance shattered. On November 30th, 1994, Tupac arrived at Quad Recording Studios in New York for a late-night session. In the building's lobby, 3 armed men ambushed him. Shots rang out. Tupac hit the ground, wounded 5 times. He survived, but the damage went deeper than Flash. While recovering in the hospital, Tupac became convinced the attack wasn't random. He believed he had been set up, and in his mind, the people already inside the studio that night, including Biggie and Sean Puffy Combs, had to know something. Both men denied any involvement, but trust had been broken beyond repair. Tupac's world shifted again in 1995 when he was sent to prison on unrelated charges. Behind bars, the anger hardened. He aligned himself with Suge Knight and Death Row Records, the West Coast powerhouse label. When he got out, he was a different man. By 1996, the music stopped being just music. Tupac's infamous track, Hit 'Em Up, didn't just call out rivals, it detonated them. He claimed to have slept with Biggie's wife, Faith Evans. He painted Bad Boy Records as fake, weak, and disloyal. It wasn't just a diss record, it was an open declaration of war. The feud spread beyond lyrics. It became East Coast versus West Coast, New York versus Los Angeles, Bad Boy versus Death Row. Magazine covers hyped it, award shows amplified it, and in back rooms and parking lots, the tension turned physical. The 1995 Source Awards became a turning point. Suge Knight took the stage and threw a thinly veiled shot at Puffy while the crowd erupted in boos and cheers. Security tightened, entourages grew larger, and the streets buzzed with talk of an inevitable collision. That collision came on September 13, 1996. Tupac Shakur died after being shot in Las Vegas, a murder that, like Biggie's, would remain officially unsolved. For many, Tupac's death planted the seed for Biggie's, and when Biggie stepped foot in Los Angeles 6 months later, some believed the stage for revenge had already been set. If the East Coast versus West Coast feud was the spark, what came next was the explosion.
When news broke that Biggie Smalls had been killed, the first question in millions of minds wasn't who did it. It was this payback for Tupac? The parallels were impossible to ignore. Both men were young, Tupac 25, Biggie 24. Both were hip-hop icons at the peak of their careers. Both were shot in drive-by attacks under the cover of night, and both murders happened just months apart. The streets didn't see coincidence. They saw a chain reaction. Rumors swirled that factions within Death Row Records wanted blood for Tupac's killing. Others claimed it was gang politics spilling over into the music industry. A smaller but louder group accused Bad Boy Records of having deeper enemies than anyone realized. Media outlets fed the speculation. Magazine covers ran Biggie's and Tupac's faces side by side, framed like opposing generals. Radio hosts debated theories live on air, and in barbershops, corner stores, and clubs, the talk was the same. They got Pac. Now, they got Biggie. The theory made emotional sense, but the deeper reality was harder to pin down. Biggie had publicly said he wanted the feud to end. In interviews, he spoke about moving on, about building bridges, about focusing on music. But in the raw, paranoid energy of the late 90s rap scene, words couldn't erase the past. The atmosphere in Los Angeles after Biggie's death was electric with both grief and suspicion. Fans gathered outside radio stations and record stores blasting his songs in tribute. Murals began appearing on brick walls overnight. Biggie's face crowned, immortalized, but beneath the memorials was a heart of truth. People wanted justice, and they doubted they would ever get it. The tension didn't just live in fan circles. Within law enforcement, there was quiet awareness that the killing could ignite more violence. The LAPD faced a choice: push hard on the investigation and risk where it might lead, or slow walk the case and keep the powder keg from exploding. They chose the latter. And in that choice, the first cracks in the investigation began to show. In the hours after Biggie Smalls was pronounced dead, the expectation was simple. A crime this public, this high profile, would be solved quickly. Dozens of witnesses had been in the area. The shooter's car had been seen by multiple people, and the killing took place in one of the most heavily trafficked intersections in Los Angeles. But inside the LAPD, the case began to unravel almost immediately. From the start, leads weren't followed. Witnesses were interviewed once, if at all. Critical statements that could have narrowed the suspect list were misplaced or left unrecorded. Surveillance footage from a nearby bank that might have caught the shooter's car was grainy, and for reasons never fully explained, it wasn't enhanced or widely circulated. Behind the scenes, fear crept into the investigation. Some officers suspected the trail might lead back to people inside their own department. Allegations began to surface that certain LAPD members had ties to Death Row Records and its network of gang-affiliated security. Pursuing that angle could mean exposing internal corruption, a risk the department seemed unwilling to take. For Biggie's family, the silence from law enforcement was deafening. Weeks passed without progress. Months turned into years. The case was labeled open, but little was happening. In 2002, Biggie's mother, Wallace, along with Faith Evans and other family members, filed a civil lawsuit accusing the LAPD of corruption, negligence, and actively covering up the involvement of rogue officers in the murder. The suit alleges that key evidence had been destroyed, internal investigations had been blocked, and the department had deliberately stalled the case to protect its own rogues. The lawsuit didn't bring justice. It was dismissed, not because the claims were disproven, but because the legal process collapsed under procedural issues and lack of cooperation from inside the LAPD. A second lawsuit in 2007, boasted with new witness statements, met the same fate. Even the FBI briefly took interest in the early 2000s, launching its own inquiry into the murder. But after months of work, they too closed their investigation, citing insufficient evidence and lack of cooperation from local authorities. By the late 2000s, the murder of Christopher Wallace had become more than an unsolved crime. It was a case study
on how power, politics, and self-preservation could outweigh truth. And in the shadows, the names of potential suspects kept surfacing, names the LAPD never officially pursued. That's where the theories began to take over.
As the official investigation slowed to a crawl, the void was filled with theories, some grounded in evidence, others in whispers that refused to die. One name surfaced more than any other: Suge Knight, the co-founder of Death Row Records and Tupac Shakur's label boss. The feud between Knight's camp and Bad Boy Records was no secret, and Tupac's murder in 1996 had left him looking for answers or revenge. Some insiders claim Suge blamed Biggie's side for Tupac's death, even if the connection was thin. The theory? Ordering Biggie's murder would send a message that no one in the feud was untouchable. Then came the darker possibility that the killing was carried out with help from inside the LAPD. Investigators and journalists began pointing to David Mack, a former LAPD officer convicted in 1997 for orchestrating a multi-million-dollar bank robbery. Mack was known to have gang affiliations, had a taste for expensive cars, including one eerily similar to the black Chevy Impala described at the scene of Biggie's murder. His connections to people within Death Row Records only deepened suspicion. Alongside Mack's name was Amir Muhammad, a close associate of Mack's and, in the eyes of former LAPD detective Russell Poole, the man who may have actually pulled the trigger. Poole claimed Muhammad matched several witness descriptions and had financial links to Mack and Death Row Records. But Muhammad denied every allegation and was never arrested. On the fringes of speculation were theories that pointed back at Sean Puffy Combs himself. Claims that internal business conflicts or insurance policies created a hidden motive. These were widely rejected by most investigators, but conspiracy theorists kept them alive, citing Puffy's presence at the scene as too coincidental to ignore. Books, documentaries, and news specials from Biggie and Tupac to Unsolved, the murders of Tupac and the Notorious B.I.G. circled back to these same names again and again. Yet, without formal charges, they remain just that: names, stories, and suspicions. Theories alone wouldn't bring justice, but in the late 2000s, a fresh set of eyes would dig into the case and uncover a story that, for many, finally made the pieces fit. And this time, the revelation would come from inside the LAPD itself. By the late 2000s, the murder of Christopher Wallace had been cold for more than a decade. The leads were stale, witnesses had gone silent, and the LAPD's credibility in the case was fractured beyond repair. That's when Greg Kading, a veteran LAPD detective, was brought in to head a joint federal task force. His mission? Reinvestigate the murders of both Tupac Shakur and Biggie Smalls, without the political interference that had poisoned the original case. Kading wasn't interested in rumors. He wanted verifiable evidence, sworn testimony, and patterns that would hold up under scrutiny. Over months of digging, interviewing gang members, flipping confidential informants, and cross-checking old case files, a new picture began to form. And it pointed in one direction. The trigger man, Kading concluded, was Wardell Poochie Fos, a respected and feared member of the Mob Piru Bloods, a gang with deep ties to Death Row Records. Poochie wasn't a random street hitter. He was someone Suge Knight allegedly trusted for sensitive jobs. According to Kading, while Suge was serving time in LA County Jail for an unrelated assault, he orchestrated the hit on Biggie as an act of retaliation for Tupac's death. The order didn't come directly. Kading uncovered testimony from a woman believed to be Suge Knight's girlfriend at the time, who regularly visited him in jail disguised as a legal aid. This ruse allowed her conversations with Suge to go unmonitored. According to her statement, Suge told her to reach out to Poochie, arrange the job, and ensure payment was delivered after it was done. She described the instructions in chilling detail: the target, the location, the time frame. And when Biggie was killed at Fairfax in Wilshire, everything matched. Multiple informants backed the same story. Some were gang affiliates who had heard the chatter on the street in the days after the murder. Others were former Death Row insiders who described Poochie as Suge's go-to when he wanted something done quietly but decisively. Kading documented it all in his book, Murder Rap. For him, the case was solved. The combination of consistent witness testimony, gang intelligence, and financial motive painted a clear picture. Suge Knight ordered the murder, and Wardell Poochie Foose pulled the trigger. But if the truth was finally known, one question still hung in the air. Why wasn't anyone arrested?
The answer would frustrate the public and close the door on any hope of a trial. When Greg Kading's findings became public, many believed justice was finally within reach. The shooter had been named, the alleged mastermind had been identified, the pieces fit together. But in the eyes of the legal system, the case wasn't just cold, it was untouchable. The most obvious barrier was that Wardell Poochie Foose was already dead. In 2003, 6 years after Biggie's murder, Poochie was gunned down while riding his motorcycle in Compton. Without a living triggerman, prosecutors had no one to put on trial for the actual killing. There would be no interrogation, no confession, and no testimony in court. Then there was the key witness, Suge Knight's former girlfriend, whose confidential cooperation had been critical in piecing together the chain of events. She had spoken under the protection of anonymity, but when it came time to testify in open court, she refused. Without her live testimony, the case's strongest direct evidence collapsed. And Suge Knight himself? He was already serving a 28-year prison sentence for a 2015 hit-and-run that left one man dead. From a practical standpoint, many in law enforcement saw no point in pursuing a decades-old murder case that would involve reopening political wounds inside the LAPD. Because that was the other unspoken barrier, corruption. Officially acknowledging Kading's conclusions would mean revisiting the department's mishandling of the case in 1997, confronting the allegations of officer involvement, and possibly facing massive lawsuits from Biggie's family. For the city of Los Angeles, it was easier to let the case remain open but inactive. The contrast with Tupac's case made it sting even more. In 2023, Dwayne Keefe D. Davis was arrested for Tupac's murder after a grand jury decided there was enough evidence to prosecute. It proved that even decades-old hip-hop murders could be brought to court when the will was there. For Biggie's murder, that will never came. In the public's eyes, the answer was out there, but in the eyes of the law, it might as well still be a mystery. And so, the focus shifted, away from the courtroom and on to the legacy Biggie left behind. On March 18, 1997, Brooklyn came to a standstill. Tens of thousands lined the streets as the hearse carrying Christopher Wallace rolled slowly through his old neighborhood. Traffic lights meant nothing. Cars pulled over. Strangers embraced. From apartment windows, people leaned out, holding radios, blasting his music into the cold air. It was more than a funeral procession. It was a coronation for the man they called the King of New York. Biggie's mother, Valletta Wallace, walked through her grief with quiet strength. She vowed that her son's name would never fade, and she became one of the most outspoken voices demanding justice. Faith Evans, his widow, and Sean Puffy Combs turned their mourning into music. Their tribute, I'll Be Missing You, dominated airwaves worldwide, becoming a global anthem of loss and remembrance. But it was Biggie's own music that kept him alive. His debut album, Ready to Die, had already secured his place as one of hip-hop's greatest storytellers. His follow-up, Life After Death, released just weeks after his murder, became an instant classic, filled with the lyrical wit, flow, and raw honesty that defined his career. Both albums are still studied, sampled, and celebrated decades later. In 2020, the Notorious B.I.G. was posthumously inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, a rare honor for a rapper, and a reminder of how far his influence reached beyond the genre. His children, C.J. Wallace and Tiana Wallace, have carried that legacy forward not through music, but by protecting his image and telling his story on their own terms. Murals of his face now watch over Brooklyn blocks like guardians. His voice echoes in clubs, on playlists, and through generations of artists who credit him as an inspiration. For fans, he remains not just a rapper, but a symbol of ambition, resilience, and the price of greatness. But even as his legacy grew, the shadow of his unsolved murder lingered. And with Kading's revelations now widely accepted, another question began to take shape, a question that could still shatter the official story. What if the truth we've been given isn't the whole truth? Nearly 37 years after 4 bullets cut short the life of Christopher Wallace, the story is still not fully closed. Greg Kading's investigation named the shooter. It named the man who allegedly ordered the hit. It laid out the chain of events in chilling detail. But the official record remains blank. No arrests, no conviction, and no courtroom testimony under oath. The LAPD's file still lists the case as open, and in the silence, new whispers have started to grow. Some claim the real motive was never retaliation for Tupac's death, that it was about money, power, and control over an industry on the verge of going global. Others hint at deeper connections where gang loyalties, record label politics, and law enforcement corruption all converged in one fatal moment at a Los Angeles intersection. There are still witnesses who have never spoken, still documents locked away in archives that may never see daylight, and still questions that, if answered, could rewrite the history of hip-hop forever. The truth we know may be the truth we were allowed to know. The rest might be buried with the people who were there. And somewhere in Los Angeles, on a corner lit by street lamps, the red light at Fairfax and Wilshire still changes, waiting for a night the city can never forget.